Speaking of restrictions, all of that, protests against such restrictions.
Yes. Okay. So this is a very interesting story, and it has a lot of facets to it. A lot of you guys have been following that there was this huge convoy of Canadian truckers who converged on Ottawa. And this protest was initially sparked by a regulation change that was actually enacted both by the Canadian government and the U.S. government that says if you are an international trucker and you're crossing national boundaries and borders, then you have to be vaccinated. And if you're not, you're going to have to be subject to tests and a 2-week quarantine, which I have to assume if you're a trucker.
Yeah, that's impossible.
That's not going to work, okay?
Right.
So this is what sort of sparked this protest, but it became this catch-all movement for everybody who was upset about the various pandemic restrictions that they still have in place in Canada. I'm not an expert on Canadian pandemic restrictions, but my understanding is that they have things in place that are more stringent than what we have here. And I should also say that they also, as a population, are more in favor of those restrictions by a large margin and generally support the broader population generally supports this direction, which I think is important context here. So let's go ahead and throw this Reuters tear sheet up on the screen that has the basic details here. Thousands stage peaceful protests in Ottawa against Canada's vaccine mandate. So again, this was a convoy. There were some wildly inflated figures on social media of 50,000 trucks. From the best I can tell, it was more like hundreds or maybe a couple thousand, nowhere near the 50,000, but that's still a very significant movement coming all the way from Western Canada and driving all the way to Ottawa, convoy across the country. They say here thousands held a loud but peaceful protest in Canada's capital, Ottawa, on Saturday against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's COVID-19 vaccine mandates on the streets and snow-covered lawn in front of Parliament. It was cold as hell while these people were out there,
it's
by the way.
16 degrees out there. Yeah.
It says that the so-called Freedom Convoy started out as a rally of truckers against a vaccine requirement for cross-border drivers, but turned into a demonstration against government overreach during the pandemic with a strong anti-vaccination streak. So what was interesting here from the media perspective is the best I could figure out, there were a few people who were part of this broader movement, not organizers of the convoy, but somehow affiliated, and supportive, I guess I should say, of this movement, who said something like, this is going to be our January 6th. And so the media took that, freaked out, ran with it. There was, a lot of concerns that this was going to be violent. They were going to storm the Capitol or whatever. Thank goodness that did not end up happening. And it seems in retrospect that those concerns may have been wildly overblown. You also had something interesting happen with GoFundMe, which is that this group raised millions of dollars. Last count that I have here is $6.2 million. We can put this tear sheet up on the screen. And GoFundMe wouldn't release that money initially. What they said is they needed to have some details about how the money was ultimately going to be spent. At this point now, they've released an initial $1 million because they say they received some details of how the money was ultimately going to be spent. But there also were concerns. I think this was part of the whole idea that this was going to be violent and it was going to be Canada's January 6th. And they didn't want to be seen to have helped to fund something that turned into some violent insurrection. So there was a whole panic and freak out of this. Let me just say one more thing about this, which is, we've got the Washington Post editorial, which shows some of the kind of media freak out.
This is how they're treating these people.
Canada must confront the toxic Freedom Convoy head on. This op-ed goes on to say they're too big to ignore and too unreasonable to placate insofar as they represent a broader challenge. Either way, we shouldn't ignore or placate them. Rather, the convoy and its supporters must be met with the counter-movement that refuses to give them an inch, but instead focuses national, subnational, and local efforts on true threats to liberty, which do exist. Listen, I feel about this kind of the same way I felt the early anti-lockdown protests that we covered here, that there was a whole media panic about in the U.S. press. I didn't support their views and their values. I don't support the views of a lot of the folks here. And there is a whole lot of anti-vaccine sentiment among this group that converged on the Capitol. But people can protest. This is, that's what democracy is about. You have a view, you disagree with the government, you go, you stage a demonstration. This is a very clever one. It's very evocative to see all these truckers in a convoy across the country and converging on the Capitol and making your point. Why is the panic and the upset around this and just totally like smearing them like they're evil wrongdoers set on like, you know, violent insurrection or whatever. I just think that was ended up being very silly.
No, the media treatment is repulsive. I would love to see GoFundMe show me one instance in which they demanded this of any Black Lives Matter thing that raised like a gajillion dollars, which they, you know, a lot of recent reporting shows has been squandered on mansions and making people rich. Yeah, demand the plan, GoFundMe. It's amazing, right? Who gets the right media treatment and who gets cracked down and who doesn't. And look, all of the treatment of these people is insane. Go ahead and put the next one up there, which is that Justin Trudeau was apparently moved to a secret location as thousands of people protested COVID-19 vax mandates for truckers and other restrictions as it made its way into Ottawa. What do these people think is going to happen? They have whipped themselves into a frenzy in which they look at their peaceful citizens, which is what was actually happening here, you know, protested. Last time I checked, Canada has some sort of freedom of assembly. Well, you know, they have whipped themselves almost into the same as us to think that they are literally going to attack them and have mass violence break out. But look, we should be very clear here. Let's put this up here. 70% of Canadians support dismissal of employees who refuse COVID-19 vaccines. All right? Canada is not even close to the US. They have a much more compliant population. To me, they're a lot more analogous to Europe. I mean, you see a lot of what's happening, the nastiness and insanity in Austria, with people getting, you know, held down for protesting, all that stuff. The Canadians are a lot more like that than they are like us. They don't have the same frontier mindset, even though they do have a frontier, and the freedom and individual liberty that is really baked into kind of our psyche doesn't really exist. And the real issue, I think, to us was not just the treatment domestically in Canada of the media there, but really of our media, trying to make this into a national story in which demonize and try and connect it to some global authoritarian right-wing movement. As you pointed out, you said that, what was it? They thought that the Russians had been placed these truckers.
Yeah, there was some I don't know, some idiot on the CBC was like, I know it might sound crazy, but we got to ask, what was Russia's involvement here? It's like, oh, well, Jesus Christ.
Yes.
I'm sorry what we have unleashed on the world. Yeah, I mean, listen, you don't have to agree with the goals and aims of every protest movement to say they got a right to protest.
Yeah, well,
I mean, it's like
I personally kind of agree with most.
It's the most basic possible thing. And I think we're right to point out, look, about 90% apparently of these truckers, of Canada's cross-border truckers, are already vaccinated. So this is probably a pretty small proportion that ultimately is upset about these rules. But listen, you want to get out there, you want to organize, you want to have a peaceful protest and make your views heard, like go to it. That is what democracy is supposed to be all about. I also saw some of Trudeau's comments, like very dismissive and contemptful as well, which I think that's a bad look. I don't think it's appropriate. And to be dismissive of people's concerns, you don't have to agree with, again, I think there are, from what I saw, interviews with this group, you've got a lot of people who have, like, you know, anti-science, sort of like anti-vax views, but people can have a right to go out and express themselves against what they're arguing about here is effectively just a government policy. It's okay to have opinions that differ from whatever the dominant ethos is ultimately here. And I think it shows a lack of confidence in your own viewpoints when, rather than engage with someone who has a different viewpoint and wants a different policy, when you just feel like you've got to smear, demonize, dismiss, censor, et cetera, et cetera. And so, to see that sort of infected the Canadian public in a similar way to what we've experienced here is not great.
Yeah, our greatest and worst export, our worst export to the world. When I say greatest, I mean biggest one is apparently our idiotic woke politics. This is, whenever I travel abroad, people are like, why are you sending this madness here? To give you an example, this was a cartoon, political cartoon, put this up there. Fascism! Yeah, it's very fascist in order to protest restrictions. These things don't even make any sense. They're completely idiotic. Of course, when I read the NPR report on this, in the protesters, one truck carried a Confederate flag. Many carried expletive-laden signs. So they're going to pick one truck out of all the trucks in order to say that this was what it was really about. Okay, first, there's no even real, you want to talk about real separatism in Canada? It actually exists. They're called the Québécois, but, our idiotic people are unable to understand other countries, even when we literally share a border with them. So, look, the media treatment on these people is repulsive. As you said, I do not support the complete anti-vax views, but for the broader support this has garnered in the United States, and even within Canada, which is a very high vaccination rate, most of them are against the restrictions. I am not going to Canada anytime soon because from the restrictions that I can tell, it sounds like complete madness. It's like being, it's far more stringent than anything in New York or, even in a New York or Washington, D.C.
I don't really like to get into criticizing other countries' policies.
Yeah, look,
and
you do what you want.
What their populations have decided on democratic basis that they want to implement and that they think makes sense for them. I'm not an expert on it. I don't want to go into that direction. But in terms of just saying, hey, it's okay for people to protest and have a different opinion on whatever that policy is, that seems like a really easy position to ultimately take.
Yeah, that's well said. And if we were the neocons, we'd be like, we need to go in there. Imagine
Let's go.
We need to spread democracy to Canada. Look, feel bad for them, but that's what the Canadians' problem.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut. Our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions. All that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.